The effect of the environment of psychic activity. Quote, any more or less important change in the living conditions of any species of animals acquires the character of permanence, and causes in the individuals of these species a true change in their requirements. Any change in the requirements of the animal calls for new measures to satisfy these new requirements, and thus leads to the formation of new habits. J.B. Lamarck. Way back, during his initial investigations, when he studied the physiology of blood circulation, Pavlov advanced for the purpose of experimental study the problem of the unity and bond between the organism and his environmental conditions. This problem, in its theoretical aspect, was posed still earlier by Sechenov. Sechenov evaluated correctly and profoundly the role of the environmental factors in the life activity of the organism. He pointed out that the impossibility of giving a scientific definition of an organism without the idea of the medium in which the animal lives. This theoretical premises required experimental corroboration, and this is what Pavlov and his pupils have done in their investigations in the field of physiology of digestion and especially in the realm of the physiology of the brain. The study of a new group of reflexes discovered by Pavlov enabled him to understand thoroughly how the bond between the higher animals and the surrounding medium is being affected. While the interrelations of the lower animals with the surrounding medium can be limited to rather primitive and constant reflexes, the inherited unconditioned ones, the diversity and mobility of the reactions of higher animals to their experiment, requires another type of reflex. The conditioned reflexes ensure this accommodation of animals to the changing conditions in their external medium. Pavlov thus showed that the substance of the environmental adjustment of animals which Darwin had postulated. Pavlov extended the method of conditioned reflexes as a means of study and explanation of the most complex so-called soul or psychic manifestation of the activities of the organism to all highly organized animals. Thus came to life the comparative or evolutional physiology of higher nervous activity. As if mapping out the program of further investigations in the field of physiology, Pavlov wrote at the dawn of the century, quote, a new and unlimited field of fruitful study is opening up. The second immense part of the physiology of the nervous system, the one which established mainly the relationship, not between separate parts of an organism, with which we have chiefly occupied up to the present time, but between the organism and the surrounding medium. According to the physiological teaching of Pavlov, evolution was connected with the fact that the nervous system of higher animals ensured their adjustment to the conditions of the external medium on the basis of formation of temporary associations. This is the physiological essence of the evolutional process. The influences of various environmental factors on the evolution of various organs of the animals were effected accordingly. The animals are capable of behavior adjustments and are, thus, able to distinguish various stimulants according to their biological significance. It is perfectly obvious, wrote Pavlov, that the entire activity of the organism must be regulated. If the animal were not, to use a biological term, accurately adjusted to its environment, it would sooner or later cease to exist. If an animal, instead of heeding for food, would shy away from it, or instead of running away from fire, would throw itself into the flames, etc., it would have perished in one way or another. It must react to its environment in such a manner that its reactive activity serve to ensure its existence. Thus, the study of the problem of unity of higher animal organisms and their environment is, in essence, the study of the balanced adaptability of the higher sections of the central nervous system to the surrounding medium. The comparative physiology of the conditioned reflex activity consists of the study of the characteristics of the higher nervous activity in various animals. It created certain premises in the development of the direction of the study of higher nervous activity, which emphasized the conditions of existence of various animals, i.e., the so-called ecological factors. Ecology, in its turn, has been enriched by the influence of the teaching of conditioned reflexes. It became possible to demonstrate how the higher nervous activity of an animal is formed under the effect of external natural influences. The ecological trend in physiology, especially in the physiology of the higher nervous system, expresses the unity of the teachings of Maturin and Pavlov. At this, being a comparatively new trend, it is not sufficiently appreciated by all concerned. Even among ecologists, specialists, one can find incorrect attitude to the ecological trend in physiology. One can agree with those who are attempting to establish a basic principle difference in the task and methods of investigation in physiology and ecology. Thus, for example, some pointed out that physiology, allegedly, is only engaged in the study of the processes in the organism of the animals, while enconology represents the reaction of the entire animal organism to its environment. If we have in mind the pre-Pavlov physiology in regard to its relation to ecology, this premise would be true. But if we are discussing the new physiological teaching created by Pavlov, especially his idea of the unity of the organism and its environment, then we must emphasize that it was Pavlov who first in physiology showed the need for ecological studies of animals and for an ecological approach to the study of the higher nervous system in particular. The ecological studies offer a convincing proof of the unity of the organism and the conditions of its existence. However, the implementation of these studies in physiology meets with a number of serious difficulties. Most of them are mainly connected with the fact that the investigation must be carried out under natural, normal conditions. Taking this in consideration, we, in our ecological laboratory investigations, employed such effects which would, as near as possible, reproduce certain natural stimulants. We tried to study in this manner the largest possible number of analyzers of the animal, and just in the study of the largest possible number of various reflexes, motor, cardiac, respiratory, and gustatory, we were hoping to obtain the characteristics of various working mechanisms and functions of the organism. As a method of investigation which justified our expectations, we used a comparative study of representatives of kindred species which lived under diverse environmental conditions: hares and rabbits, wild and domestic ducks, partridges and chicken, etc., etc. In other instances, we used as objects of study some animals which, in their natural habitat, showed clearly expressed evidence of environmental adaptation: beasts of prey, beavers, etc. The results of observations thus conducted attest first of all to the fact that various animals react, depending on their peculiarities of their environment, precisely to those stimuli which are characteristic of their natural habitat. It has been proved that of various sound stimuli which affected the observed rate of cardiac contractions, only the sound of splashing water caused in wild waterfowls a marked acceleration of the heartbeat from 176 per minute to 250 upon stimulation. Other sounds originating, for instance, upon breaking of splinters, whistle, bell ringing, etc., hardly affected the rate of the cardiac contractions, as checked electrocardiographically. The river beavers, the environmental conditions of which are highly original and typical, enable us to collect hitherto unknown facts of their respiratory and cardiovascular reflexes. Precise methods, electrocardiograph and pneumography, were used for the purpose of registration of cardiac and respiratory activity. Stimulations and reactions to sound, light, and smell were observed. It turned out that the very presence of illumination, the beavers are night animals, caused marked changes in their respiratory and cardiac activity. The respiration is accelerated and assumes a superficial character. The cardiac beat is slowed down. The beaver leads a double life, aqueous and terrestrial. Accordingly, the sound stimuli connected one of the other medium. Water splashing, breaking of splinters, crackling of leaves caused marked respiratory and cardiac reflexes. It seems that, in connection with the night manner of life, which requires the ability to orientate oneself in the darkness, the odor analyzer in beavers has particularly acute sensitivity. A particularly strong reaction in the form of a sudden halt in the respiratory movements were observed in these animals in response to the smell of a castoreum spray. A strong but artificial stimulus like acetone caused only a reduction in the respiratory intensity, without a change in its rate. Excuse me for 1 second. A very good result were obtained in the experiments with wild ducks. First, their ability to differentiate olfactory sensations was tested. As indicator of this differentiation, we employed the change in their respiratory movements registered by means of an elastic air chamber. As stimuli, we used tar, ether, ammonium, mint, acetic acid, thymol. All these reagents had no effect on the respiratory movements. A constant and well-expressed reflex of accelerated respiration was obtained with rosemary. Of course, only the olfactory stimulus was changed, all other conditions remaining unchanged in the experiment. Presumably, the presence of a selective reaction to rosemary is due to the fact that the ducks fly to the Mediterranean zone for the winter and feed there on grass which contains rosemary in its esters. In testing various sound stimuli, we observed slight, often fading reactions as, for example, to the metronome. The orientation reflexes to the sound of splashing water were more constant. Only in one case, when a so-called manak, a little device for imitating the sounds of natural quacking of ducks, was used, we obtained in response a very stable and constant motor reaction which reflected itself on the register of respiratory movements. This reflex is so stable that we conceived the idea of utilizing it as an unconditioned reinforcement for the formation of the conditioned reflex, which we successfully accomplished. We collected much data on the formation of conditioned reflexes in various fish. In osseous fish, slabs, the protective conditioned reflexes to light were developed on 6-8 combinations of the stimuli with an electric current, and in bottom-dwelling fish, sea ruff, the conditioned reflex to light could not be developed even after 345 conditions. In the trigon microps, which habitats in shallow creeks, the conditioned protective sound reflex appeared after 5 to 8 combinations. In thorn skates, which habitat at deep sea bottom, the same reflex could be obtained only after several scores of combinations. The study of various reflexes in rabbits and hares showed that particularly clear and constant respiratory reflexes are formed in these animals only by a definite group of stimuli. Rustle was one of the sound stimuli. The movement of some object in the field of the hare's vision was one of the visual stimuli. Interesting data were obtained in the study of stimuli in touching various areas of the skin. It turned out that, in rabbits, the so-called tactile stimulations either caused no changes on the nomogram or affected it in a significant and similar manner, independently of the area of stimulation. A different picture was observed in hares. Their reflexes, in the form of their acceleration of respiration, were generally expressed more strongly than rabbits. Stimulation of the skin of the neck behind the ears elicited very constant reflexes. We could continue with the description of similar facts which has been observed in other animals and under stimulations of a different character. But even the cited data ought to be sufficient to show that of all environmental stimulants similar in their physical characteristics, the most outstanding are those which bear a particularly close relationship to the hereditary properties of a specific type of animal, and none other. This is presumably explained by the fact that certain specific stimuli have been present for many centuries in the environmental compiles of given animals, and their effect has been therefore reinforced in the special nervous structures by means of heredity. The conception of the so-called adequacy, or the correlation between the conditioned and unconditioned stimuli in comparative physiology, does not, of course, affect one of the general principles of Pavlov's teaching, that any change in the external or internal medium may act as a conditioned stimulus. However, in acknowledging this fact, we must not doubt the possibility that, in the unlimited number of possible stimuli, one of them may prove to be more effective and others less effective. This will depend on how close a given stimuli is to the natural environment and manner of life of the animal. Only in this sense can we state that, in comparative physiological investigations, the most important element is not so much the physical or chemical property of the stimulus as its relation to the specific environmental conditions of a given animal. This relationship determines the final adaptation effect, which appears in response to the stimulus used. The above cited environmental data confirm this thesis. The writings of Pavlov also attest to it. In his very first of the lectures on the function of the large cerebral hemisphere, he cites an example of the natural and not the artificial stimuli. He speaks of the sight and the sounds of a powerful beast and their significance as signals to a small animal. The essential feature of the higher nervous activity, writes Pavlov, consists here not of the action of numerous signal stimulants only, but also of the essential fact that these stimuli change their physiological action under certain conditions. The external medium in which the animal lives is so infinitely complex and is in such constant state of flux that the complex, closed system of the organism can have a chance of balancing it only if it, too, fluctuates correspondingly. In connection with this, the significance of the same stimulus to the animal may manifest itself differently. All above cited examples refer to the inherited characteristics of the animal nervous system. However, this selective attitude to external stimuli may take place also in the case of an acquired fixed life experience. When a certain phenomenon has remained for a long time within the environmental circle of life of the animal, it can very easily assume the role of a conditioned stimulus. This rule retains its strength in relation to man also. We observed, in the case of a patient, a driver by occupation, that the conditioned reflexes to a flash of a red light were formed instantly. When we employed stimuli, we noticed that the very sound of a human voice, among other sounds, proved to be most effective even in cases where the words used as stimuli were entirely unfamiliar and not understood by the subject under experimentation. Thus, the significance of the environment in the formation of the function of the organism must be evaluated not abstractly, but concretely and in connection with the relationship of various animals to the concrete conditions of external medium. Pavlov taught it, and the works of Maturin attest to it convincingly. According to Maturin, the plant organisms possess a selective faculty of accommodation to the external environments. This selective property represents the result of the historic adaptability of the preceding generations to the conditions of the external medium. In its unity with the external medium, the organism manifests an active relationship to environmental effects. In acknowledging the correctness of this thesis in regard to plants, we consider it even more important to appreciate its significance when applied to the animal organism. The complex construction of the animal organism, the interconnection and interaction of its organs controlled by the nervous system, the multiform effects of the environment on the organism, all this renders the problem of the interrelation of the animal organism and its environment very difficult to study. In studying the problem of the mechanism and its environment in the frame of evolution, we stop to think, first of all, of the paths of which the organism follows in adapting itself to the conditions of existence which constitute its environment, keeping in mind especially the higher nervous activity. We often stress the fact, in accordance with various statements of Pavlov, that its evolutional progress is manifested in the acquisition of the property of a finer and more accurate adaptation to the surrounding medium. This point of view is correct, but it has one-sided character. The precision and finesse in the functions of various sensory organisms, or organs, do not yet in themselves clarify thoroughly the essence of the problem. Engels pointed out long ago that an eye of an eagle sees much farther than of a man, but a man sees in things much more than does an eagle. In concentrating their attention on the refinement and accuracy of the work of the analyzers, some scientists are forgetting the following admonition of Pavlov. Quote, "The biological essence of conditioned reflexes consists of the fact that the scanty external stimulants of unconditioned reflexes become more connected, under certain conditions, coincidence in time, with the innumerable phenomena of the external medium, which serves as signals to these stimuli. Thus, all organic activities, effects of the unconditioned reflexes, enter into finer and more precise relationship with the external medium in its progressively larger regions." Spacing of last phrase of Dr. Bryukov. The stressing by Pavlov of the progressively increasing regions of adaptation is very important to the understanding of the problem of the evolutional progress of the animal organism. There is no doubt that the evolution of species is connected with the direct expansion of the area of habitation. A very legitimate question arises in connection with it, whether this peculiarity of the evolutional process does not lead to the phenomenon that the animal, in expanding the circle of the adaptation of its reactions, is capable at the same time to reduce the finesse of the work of separate analyzers. According to the data of the Polish scientist J. Dembowski, a spider accurately reacts to the oscillation of the web when it corresponds to the frequency of movement of the wings of an insect. The spider achieved high skill precisely in this respect. The results of our investigations brought out many instances of highly specificity of animal reactions to the effect of the external medium, even in cases of rather low level or high nervous activity. It follows that the degree of the general development of the higher nervous system cannot be determined solely by the degree of perfection of one or another organ of sensation. We happened to carry out observations of an eagle. Our attempts to take down an electrocardiogram were connected with great difficulties, for the eagle was very aggressive and, besides, had just been recently caught. An idea came to us to bind his eyes. When this was done, the eagle seemed to have become paralyzed. He did not move and was amenable to any manipulation. It is not surprising if we recall the ancient manner of falcon hunt. In this type of hunt, one puts on the head of a falcon, or the golden eagle, a small hood which covers its eyes. It then remained sitting quietly on the shoulder or arm of its master. Upon the appearance of a hare, for instance, the hood was taken off. The bird of prey would swoop down on its victim. Upon retrieving the hare, one would again put the hood on the bird's head. The elimination of one analyzer, true a highly perfected one, attests to the fact of how insignificant is the role of the other analyzers in the relationship between the eagle and its environment. Indeed, the usual habitat of the eagle almost completely excludes the effect of sounds or doors or odors, but the sharpening of vision is vitally important to it. In connection with the study of the ecological correlation of stimuli, we come across another important circumstance. In a number of cases, we happened to observe the exceptional strength, the inextinguishableness of the conditioned reflex which has been formed in response to corresponding stimuli. Certain stimuli, used in the experiments, invariably caused one or another effect, change in respiration or acceleration of heartbeat without a subsequent extinction. We shall cite a few examples. A conditioned reflex was formed in a hare by means of a conditioned stimulus, which in this case was the sound of clucking, to the natural one, which accompanies the animal's sucking of the breast. It was reinforced by a visual stimulation, movement of an object in the field of vision, and a tactile one. Stimulation of the skin in the area of the neck. The conditioned reflex appeared after the third combination. For almost 2 years after formation, this reflex was fully preserved despite the fact that the conditioned reflex was used about 2,000 times without its reinforcing stimuli. When, with the same reinforcement, a conditioned reflex was produced using a metronome, it faded out without reinforcement within a comparatively short time, after 10 seances, or seconds perhaps. Obviously, in the first case of combination of two stimuli, close to the animal, took place, the conditioned and the unconditioned. As a result, an unusual stability was created in the conditioned reflex. We have already mentioned a number of cases where the fading of the reflex did not take place. We had examples, the reflexes on the heart in the wild waterborne birds upon splashing of water, the motor reflexes to the sound of manka in wild ducks, the respiratory reflexes in hares to the sound of rustle of paper, or to the movement of an object in the field of vision. Our laboratory received once a brood of baby foxes removed directly from the layer. The use of various sounds, including that of a squeak of a mouse, caused no reaction in the little foxes. However, as soon as the baby fox had eaten a mouse for the first time, a stable conditioned reflex was formed to the squeak of a mouse. These reflexes also proved to be particularly inextinguishable. The examples of inextinguishable conditioned reflexes lead to the assumptions that the reflexes on splashing manic, beckoning rustle, etc. are not of the unconditioned reflexes type, but represent special conditioned reflexes. Presumably, certain circumstances connected with their origin, some ecological adequacy of stimuli of a conditioned and of an unknown to us unconditioned character, made these conditioned reflexes resemble unconditioned ones in their stability. The above described facts attached to the most lively attention, for they touched upon a very important problem of the transition of conditioned reflexes into conditioned ones, and thus enabled us to approach the study of the physiological mechanisms of the inheritance of the acquired temporary associations. The large factual material which we had collected in our laboratory by means of an objective method, as well as the literary data, attest to the fact that the ecological correlation of the stimuli represents the determining condition for the formation and the stability of a reflex. This has the closest relationship to the problem of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. The Muturin biology regards the process of adaptation as the integral element in the inheritance of the characteristics which the organism acquired in the course of its individual development. Pavlov, too, was in full accord with his view, or this view, and thought that some conditioned reflexes eventually change into unconditioned ones, thus becoming inherited reflexes. The research of the two great modern naturalists, Muturin and Pavlov, demonstrated the complete inconsistency of the metaphysical ideas of the followers of Weissman and Morgan, who denied, as is well known, the possibility of inheriting acquired characteristics. Having established the fact of mutation of organism in the course of evolutional development, Darwin deviated to a great extent from the task connected with the search of the causes underlying this variability. Moreover, The question of the necessity of active interference in the processes of mutability of the organism completely escaped his field of vision, which is explained by the limitations of the bourgeois outlook which formed the basis of Darwin's views. This great task was undertaken by Maturin and Pavlov. Maturin did not only conceive the idea, he actually developed scientific ways of plant mutation. His outstanding practical achievements in this respect are widely known. The teachings of Pavlov and Maturin, kindred in spirit, developed along the same path. Common to both was the stringent for an active intervention in the life phenomena which were the object of their study. Lots of typos in this one. This was in accordance with the requirement of the materialistic dialectics, which served as the basis on which Maturin and Pavlov were developing their scientific theories. The Maturin teaching interpreted the causes of mutability and, thus, naturally advanced the most important task of a directed change in the properties of an organism. The same trait characteristics, in the most brilliant manner, the physiology of Pavlov. Let me read that again. The same trait characterizes, in the most brilliant manner, the physiology of Pavlov. Maturin improved the great mastery, the nature of plant organisms. Pavlov constantly kept in view the task of improving the functions of the animal organism. Let us cite one example. In developing his teachings of higher nervous activity, Pavlov showed that, in spite of the differences in the higher nervous activity of various animals, one can isolate among them several groups more or less similar as to the properties of their nervous system. As the basis of his teachings on the varieties of nervous systems, Pavlov enumerated the following characteristics of cortical nervous processes. 1. The force of the stimulating and inhibiting process. 2. The degree of equilibrium between the stimulating and inhibiting processes. 3. The mutability or mobility of the stimulating and inhibiting processes. Questions arose in the study of higher nervous activity. How is the type of higher nervous activity formed in an animal? What in the organism of the animal is dependent upon inherited characteristics of the nervous system, and what is acquired in connection with the conditions of development of life? And what can be changed into the desired direction? These questions were studied by Pavlov in a specially constructed genetic station in the village of Kalushi, near Leningrad. Conscious of the great value of Pavlov's research, the Soviet government especially assigned large sums of money for the construction of this scientific combine, the greatest in the world, where, in addition to a large number of laboratories, nurseries were created for the bringing up of animals from known and studied parents. The construction of this scientific little city, the capital of conditioned reflexes as Pavlov named it, was completed in 1935. Pavlov himself could not expand to the full extent the investigations which he had planned, though some important experiments had already been carried out before his death. A litter of puppies taken from a female was divided into two groups. The puppies of each group were raised separately. One group was allowed to run around freely, to play together and to meet other animals and humans. The puppies of the second group were raised under the conditions of strict isolation. They were never allowed to leave their cells. They saw no other dogs, etc. When the animals of both groups grew up, they were subjected to tests by the method of conditioned reflexes. The qualitative differences in the higher nervous activity of the representatives of each group were markedly expressed. Puppies raised under normal conditions did not differ from normal animals, while the puppies raised in isolation cells showed the weakness of their nervous activity. At each new stimulus, the usual ringing of a bell, for instance, the dog was pressing itself to the floor, trembled. It developed to a marked degree the so-called passive protective reaction. These tests prove convincingly the role of the environment in the development of higher nervous activity. In Pavlov's laboratory, special observations were carried out which were directed toward the solution of the problem: whether one can strengthen a weak nervous system in the animal, whether one can reinforce its basic process, such as, for example, the processes of inhibition. These tests brought positive results. It turned out that by means of education and training, one can strengthen and reinforce the functions of the brain. On the basis of his own observations and the work of his pupils, Pavlov became convinced of the possibility of improving the weakened functions of the organism. Pavlov spoke, in connection with this, of his dream to perfect the types of higher nervous activity to the highest possible limit. At the time of Miturin, the servants of religion were indignant at his aim to change the properties of plants with the view of improving their quality. One of the priests demanded that Miturin cease his fruitful experiments in the alteration of plant organisms, even requested the closing of the nursery, quote, "this seat of depravity which corrupted the hearts of believers." One cannot refuse a certain force or foresight to this servant of a cult who is able, even at the start of the creative work of Miturin, to realize what a crushing blow can the teaching of Miturin inflict to the religious ideas about the divine providence, which allegedly controls any and all organic changes. It is obvious that an irreparable gap in religious dogmas was created by Pavlov's teaching, in which he stated that the physiologist could actively interfere with the realm of the soul, this domain since eons of time forbidden to man. Religion proceeds from the premise that the world itself is unchangeable and passive. Not a single hair will fall off the man's head without the will of God. So to state the theoreticians of religion. Whether one speaks of disease, it is the punishment by God. Of recovery, it has to be asked of God. Same as with drought or rain, fertility of cattle, etc. Everything is granted, sent down by God. The ideal of a religious man, of a true son of God, or, as the clerics say, God's slave, is that of an individual absolutely devoid of will, totally obedient to a higher, completely unfathomable and mysterious force. The teaching of Pavlov inflicted a crushing blow to the religious conceptions of the unchangeable and divine substance of the soul, and demonstrated the possibility of a directed modification of psychic activity as the result of changes in the environment.